Many studies have shown that hyperlexia is often found in ASD populations. There are various definitions of hyperlexia. Healy's definition is precocious onset of single word decoding. In other words, able to decode probably before they're taught, very young, impaired reading comprehension, impaired listening comprehension, exceptional single word ability compared with their language ability or cognitive ability. Some possible reasons for hyperlexia are given. The first is related to weak central coherence, meaning that they're processing the written word in lower cortical areas, but then they have difficulty making connections and associations. The other is that their narrowed and restricted interests may contribute to this strong decoding because they get so fascinated by the letters, and that leads to extensive reading and practice. So because they're drawn to letters, they practice decoding more. Cardoso, Martins, and De Silva did a study where they really investigated hyperlexia, and they found that their hyperlexics performed as well as controls on non-word reading measures. So those children who were pretty hyperlexic did just as well on non-word reading measures, which is a little different than what we saw in Nation's article, but Nation used a broader range of readers, not just hyperlexic readers. And they also found that most of the errors were phonological in nature, in phonological encoding in nature rather than visual. They also suggested that the indifference to the meaning of things may provide a focus on decoding, and then they may only later gradually attend to meaning. At age 5, Temple Grandin chose suitcase as the picture because that started with a B because she thought it was a box. She ignored bird bath because she thought it was a garden. So we have to be careful also when we're assessing skills, don't we? That we may infer meaning that children with autism may not infer, and so we may think it's their phonological skills when in fact it reflects their language knowledge. So overall, children with ASD appear to have depressed phonological ability, especially in sound blending. And then one study looked at children with ASD with and without a history of hyperlexia, and they found that the children with the history of hyperlexia did better on phonological awareness tests than children without the history of hyperlexia, but both groups did poorer than typically developing children. This may not be true of children with lower vocabulary or intellectual levels. We haven't tested that yet. So Gabig found that children with autism had a lot of trouble with elision and sound blending. They gave a test called the C-top, and elision is say top without the T. And they found that elision was more difficult for kids with autism than sound blending. They also found that the child's receptive vocabulary was correlated highly with their performance on the elision tasks. Additionally, they found correlations with word recognition. So both groups were similar in both words and non-word recognition. So that's kind of the second study that we've seen that has said they do just as well words and non-words. But these are children, again, who are in the hyperlexic range or are really pretty well good at decoding. And that there was some variability with ASD group on words and non-words. In other words, there was a higher standard deviation between abilities on words and non-words. But there was no relationship between the phonological awareness test and the word recognition test for children with ASD. So now let's talk about spelling. Spelling appears to be largely IQ dependent. Across 2 large studies involving a total of 280 participants with ASD, Mays and Calhoun found that all of their participants with average IQ scores and approximately half of the children who had IQ scores below 80 achieved average scores on decoding and spelling measures. So in general, children with ASD tend to do quite well on spelling measures. However, there appears to be subgroups, much the same as in Nation's group. There are good spellers. There are spellers who have difficulty with morphological issues, such as attaching endings or changing words to add prefixes or suffixes. And then there's a smaller group that has semantic issues, and these children have difficulty with homonyms. They neglect the root word and get the prefixes and the suffixes correctly, or they'll insert whole words when they attempt to spell. For instance, we had one child who said discussion, or spelled discussion for discussion, and so the word guess, G-U-E-S-S, was wholly inserted in there in their attempt to spell a new word. Now let's move to reading comprehension. As far as vocabulary is concerned, preschool children with ASD are severely delayed in their vocabulary relative to their nonverbal mental ages. But although the discrepancies between nonverbal and verbal abilities are there, they often diminish with age in children who are higher functioning. So individuals with ASD overall show a limited vocabulary knowledge as adults, but there is some evidence that they kind of catch up as they grow older. So now let's look at narratives. Children with autism are more likely to include bizarre or inappropriate utterances during their story retellings, even when compared with Down syndrome or compared with verbal age matched children. They also had more difficulty in inserting their personal experience in their narratives and in building a causal relationship in their narratives. They tend to give a series of events rather than really getting the essence of the coherence of the story. The additional challenge of personal narratives may reflect that requirement for generating and formulating both the content of what's been happening and the structure of the narrative, as opposed to retelling one that is recreated from a storybook. Now let's talk about fluency. Many times children with autism are seen as being fluent readers because they can decode rapidly, but if you listen to them, they have poor modulated prosody. Their intonation doesn't seem to match the semantic content of what they're reading, and their pausing and grouping don't reflect, a thought. They kind of are till they run out of breath. And you also won't see them go back and correct or repair as other good readers do.